The courtroom was eerily silent, a heavy weight hanging in the air, as all eyes were on Alexander Holt, the billionaire business tycoon whose wealth and power had long shielded him from any consequence. His usual confident, almost cocky demeanor was on full display. Leaning back in his chair with a smug smile, he appeared untouchable. To him, this trial was just another inconvenience, a minor distraction in the empire he had built. "Ms. Dawson, I'll give you this," Alexander chuckled, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You've got guts dragging me into this circus." The spectators in the courtroom muttered among themselves, some shaking their heads at the billionaire's audacity, others equally stunned by the nerve he had to downplay the seriousness of the case against him. At the plaintiff's table, a determined young woman stood tall, her gaze unwavering. Elizabeth Dawson, in her late 20s, was no ordinary woman trying to survive the system. She had prepared for this moment with everything she had: months of research, nights of sleepless toil. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for the families, the lives that depended on the survival of the community center. Alexander was determined to bulldoze for a high-end development project. Her lawyer, David Sanchez, approached the bench with a flash drive in hand. "Your Honor," David said, his tone firm but respectful, "we would like to present evidence that sheds light on Mr. Holt's true intentions. We believe it is critical to this case." The judge, a seasoned and no-nonsense man, nodded. The courtroom technician approached and plugged the flash drive into the computer. The screen flickered to life behind the judge, and a low murmur rippled through the room. Alexander's confident smirk faded as the footage began to play. The room fell into stunned silence, each person anxiously watching what would unfold on the screen. As the video played, gasps filled the air. What was shown was undeniable proof, something the billionaire couldn't easily talk his way out of. He had been caught on tape, exposed for things far worse than simply threatening to take over a piece of land. His face turned pale as the implications of the footage became clear. For the first time, Alexander Holt was no longer the untouchable mogul. He was vulnerable. But just as the courtroom erupted into a frenzy of gasps and whispers, the judge slammed his gavel. "Order in the court!" he shouted, trying to regain control of the chaos. But the damage had already been done. The video had changed everything. The story now pivots to how Elizabeth arrived at this point. Months earlier, when she first heard of the plans to demolish the community center in downtown Chicago, she had no idea she was about to enter a battle that would define her life. It had been a spring afternoon when she first found out the land her beloved community center sat on was being sold to a developer. A luxury hotel was the proposed project, and hundreds of families who depended on the services the center provided would soon be displaced. Elizabeth couldn't just sit by. She knew she had to do something. Her first meeting with Alexander Holt happened in a conference room packed with local community leaders, each one fighting for the center's survival. Alexander walked in late, as if he owned the room, his expensive suit pressed and immaculate. He hardly acknowledged the people around him, distractedly fiddling with his phone as he settled into his seat. "We can't just tear down this center, Mr. Holt," Elizabeth said, her voice steady and determined. "This isn't just a building. It's a lifeline. People's lives depend on this place." Alexander glanced up from his phone, his expression unreadable. A cold, dismissive laugh escaped him. "This is business, Ms. Dawson," he replied. "People like me make things happen. There's always collateral damage. They'll adapt. You'll adapt." Those words stung, but they ignited a fire in Elizabeth. She wasn't going to let him win, not without a fight. After the meeting, Elizabeth didn't give up. She rallied the community, organizing protests, circulating petitions, and pushing the media to cover the fight. But Holt wasn't backing down either. He threw his wealth, his lawyers, and his PR machine into full force to neutralize any opposition. His legal team filed injunctions, and his media blitz painted Elizabeth as a misguided idealist. The odds seemed stacked against her, but Elizabeth refused to back down. She spent countless hours in the community center, helping those in need and researching Holt's business practices. What she uncovered shocked her. Beneath the surface of his polished empire lay a web of corruption, fraudulent financials, backroom deals, and enough shady dealings to ruin him if exposed. One night, while reviewing documents in her office at the center, Elizabeth received a visit from a man, someone who appeared scared, looking over his shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was following him. His hands trembled as he spoke. "Are you Ms. Dawson?" he whispered. "I am," she replied cautiously. "I used to work for Alexander Holt," the man said, his voice shaky. "I know things that can help you. But if Holt finds out I'm talking to you—" His voice trailed off, and Elizabeth could see the fear in his eyes. She assured him that his identity would be protected. He handed her a small USB drive. "This is all I have," he said. "Use it wisely." That night, Elizabeth plugged the USB drive into her computer, and what she found was a gold mine of evidence: emails, financial records, and videos documenting years of unethical practices. One video, in particular, stood out. A video that would change everything. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The judge looked from Elizabeth to Alexander Holt, sensing the pivotal moment at hand. "Ms. Dawson," the judge said, his tone stern, "do you understand the gravity of the evidence you have submitted?" "I do, Your Honor," Elizabeth replied, "and I believe the truth needs to be heard." The judge nodded, signaling the technician to prepare the video again. But just as the play button was about to be pressed, the door to the courtroom burst open, and a man rushed in. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice frantic. The room once again erupted into chaos. The man who entered was tall, his face pale, and sweat streaking down his forehead. He was dressed in a wrinkled suit, clearly having rushed to get here. His hands shook as he held a folder close to his chest. "I have more evidence," he said, his voice shaking. The courtroom fell silent, everyone now wondering what new twist was about to unfold. 6 months earlier, Elizabeth Dawson had been living a quiet, fulfilling life, working as a volunteer at the local community center in the heart of Chicago. The center had always been a safe haven for families struggling to make ends meet, offering everything from food drives to job training, after-school programs, and emotional support for the elderly. It was a place where hope blossomed amidst the harsh realities of the neighborhood. For Elizabeth, the community center had been more than just a place to work. It was where she had first learned the importance of fighting for the underdog, for those whose voices were often silenced in the face of wealth and power. She poured her heart into her role, organizing food drives, teaching life skills, and simply offering a kind ear to anyone who needed it. But then came the news that shook her world. The building and the land the center sat on had been sold to a development company. The city had approved plans for a luxury hotel to replace the community center, and with that, dozens of families would lose access to crucial resources that helped them survive. The development project was being led by none other than Alexander Holt. Elizabeth sat in her small office, staring at the letter in her hands, unable to process the full weight of what it meant. The land the center occupied was to be sold to Holt Enterprises, one of the largest and most influential real estate development firms in the city. Holt had a reputation for demolishing neighborhoods to make way for high-end projects, leaving families who had lived there for decades displaced and often without compensation. Elizabeth knew she couldn't just let it happen. It was in a community meeting that Elizabeth's first real encounter with Alexander Holt took place. The room was packed with concerned local residents and community leaders. Everyone was gathered to discuss the future of the center and to plead with Holt's company to reconsider their plans. The door swung open, and Alexander strode in, looking every bit the part of the wealthy mogul. His tailored suit and polished demeanor stood in stark contrast to the modest surroundings of the meeting room. He took his time to settle into a chair, ignoring the pleas of the others, more focused on his phone than on the issue at hand. His indifference was palpable, as though the concerns of those in the room didn't even register. Finally, Elizabeth stood up, her voice firm, cutting through the tension in the room. "Mr. Holt, this center isn't just a building. It's a lifeline. You're not just displacing bricks and mortar. You're displacing people's lives. Families who rely on this place every single day." Holt didn't even look up from his phone as she spoke. His lips curled into a small, dismissive smile before he finally looked her way. "Ms. Dawson, this is business. People like me make things happen. Sometimes there's collateral damage. You'll adapt," he said, his tone oozing with condescension. The words stung more than she wanted to admit, but they also ignited something in her. Elizabeth didn't just see this as a fight for the center. It had become something much bigger. This was about standing up to a system that allowed people like Holt to get away with trampling on the lives of the less powerful. This was a battle against corporate greed, and Elizabeth wasn't about to let Holt win. Elizabeth left that meeting more determined than ever. She immediately began organizing protests, gathering signatures for petitions, and reaching out to the media to shine a spotlight on the issue. It wasn't long before news outlets picked up the story, casting Elizabeth as a symbol of resistance against unchecked corporate power. However, Alexander Holt wasn't about to back down either. Using his immense wealth and influence, he launched his own counterattack. Holt's legal team filed injunctions, aiming to stall any progress. His PR team worked overtime to paint Elizabeth and the community's efforts as naive and misguided. They tried to silence the press, and the city's officials who had initially supported the community center found themselves under increasing pressure to retract their support. But none of that deterred Elizabeth. Late nights, endless hours of research, and countless conversations with the community led her to a shocking discovery. Holt Enterprises was far more than just a real estate development company. Beneath the surface, Holt's empire was built on a foundation of corruption, bribed officials, rigged contracts, and backdoor deals that had kept his projects moving forward without scrutiny. One night, while going through old records and legal documents, Elizabeth received an unexpected visitor. The man's eyes darted around nervously as he approached her desk. He looked like he had been on the run. His clothes were rumpled, and he was clearly exhausted. "Are you Elizabeth Dawson?" he whispered. "Yes," Elizabeth responded cautiously, sensing something was off. "I used to work for Holt Enterprises," the man continued, his voice shaking. "I know things that can help you expose him." Elizabeth's heart raced, but she kept her calm. "What kind of things?" she asked. The man handed her a small USB drive. "This has everything: emails, financial records, the proof you need to bring him down. But if Holt finds out I'm talking, I'm as good as dead." Elizabeth took the drive, her mind reeling with the possibilities. She promised the man that his identity would remain protected, but she had no idea just how much his information would change the course of everything. That night, Elizabeth plugged the USB into her laptop. As the files loaded, her eyes widened. The data revealed years of illegal activities, money laundering, fraudulent transactions, and unethical business practices, all orchestrated by Holt. But it was the video file that shocked her the most. The video was a private conversation, filmed without Holt's knowledge. In it, he discussed his plans for the community center and the families who would be displaced. The words that came out of his mouth were chilling, ruthless, and calculating. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the video. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for. But as the pieces began to fall into place, Elizabeth knew she couldn't back down now. She was in this fight for the long haul, and Holt had underestimated her. Back in the courtroom, the tension was thick as Elizabeth prepared to present the evidence to the judge. Holt sat at the defense table, a smug expression still on his face, but his eyes were no longer filled with the same confidence. He knew that the walls were starting to close in. The court was packed, the air charged with anticipation. Elizabeth sat at the plaintiff's table, feeling the weight of the moment. She had spent months preparing for this trial, and now it was finally time to present the evidence that would expose Alexander Holt's empire of corruption. But even with the truth on her side, the stakes had never been higher. Holt's influence and wealth were vast, and the odds were still stacked against her. As the judge entered the room, the whispers quieted. Judge Robert Larson was a seasoned, no-nonsense figure, and it was clear he wasn't going to tolerate any disruptions. Holt, sitting confidently at the defense table, gave Elizabeth a quick, dismissive glance, as though she were nothing more than a nuisance. His lawyer, a sharp-suited man with a cold gaze, sat beside him, ready to deflect whatever came their way. Elizabeth's lawyer, David Sanchez, stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we would like to introduce evidence that is crucial to this case. This footage clearly shows the defendant's involvement in a series of illegal activities. We believe it will help prove that Mr. Holt's actions were not only unethical, but also criminal." David handed the USB drive to the court clerk, who passed it to the technician. The large screen behind the judge flickered to life, and Elizabeth's heart raced. This was it. The moment that could change everything. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the video began to play. It showed Alexander Holt in a private meeting, his voice low but unmistakable as he discussed his plans to raise the community center for his luxury development project. His words were arrogant and cold, dripping with disdain for the people whose lives would be ruined in the process. Elizabeth had expected him to be ruthless, but hearing him speak with such disregard for human life made her stomach churn. The recording was damning. It was clear that Holt had no interest in the families that depended on the center, no concern for the communities he was displacing. It was all about the money, all about profit. As the video played, gasps rippled through the courtroom. Holt's smirk faltered for a brief moment, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. His lawyer shot to his feet, objecting vehemently. "Your Honor, this evidence is inadmissible. It was obtained illegally and without proper authorization." But the judge was already motioning for silence. "I'll allow it to be presented," he said, his tone firm. "This court is here to uncover the truth, and we will not be swayed by procedural objections." Holt's lawyer opened his mouth to protest further, but Judge Larson silenced him with a sharp look. "I will not tolerate any more disruptions. This trial will proceed as scheduled." Elizabeth felt a surge of triumph as she watched the video unfold, but the victory was short-lived. Just as the video ended, the doors of the courtroom burst open. A man, disheveled and panting, rushed in, holding a folder tightly to his chest. "I have more evidence," the man said urgently. "You have to see this." The courtroom erupted into chaos once again. The man was tall, his face pale with stress, his clothes rumpled as if he had run all the way here. Elizabeth watched as the judge looked toward the new arrival, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who are you?" Judge Larson demanded, his voice stern. "My name is Ryan Miller," the man said, his voice shaky. "I used to work for Holt Enterprises. I know things that can help prove the defendant's guilt. I need to testify." The tension in the room was palpable. Holt's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is absurd. This man cannot just waltz in here and claim to have more evidence. This is highly irregular." Ryan Miller's eyes darted nervously between Holt and the judge. He seemed on the verge of collapsing, but he stood firm. "I know what I'm about to say will make me a target. Holt has already ruined countless lives, but I can't stay silent anymore." The judge looked at him carefully. "Mr. Miller, do you understand that submitting evidence at this stage could lead to legal consequences for you?" Ryan nodded, his face pale but resolute. "I understand, Your Honor. But I've been watching this trial unfold, and I can't let this injustice continue. If I don't speak now, it may be too late for the people who depend on that community center. Please, you have to hear what I have to say." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. Who was this man? Why was he willing to risk everything? And more importantly, what did he know about Holt that could turn the tide of the trial? After a long pause, Judge Larson sighed. "Very well, Mr. Miller. You will be allowed to present your evidence, but be warned. Any attempt to manipulate the proceedings will not be tolerated." Ryan stepped forward, still shaking but determined. He handed the judge the folder he had been clutching so tightly. The judge flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise. The documents Ryan had brought with him were nothing short of explosive. They contained internal memos, emails, and financial records that linked Holt Enterprises to a series of illegal activities. The evidence corroborated Elizabeth's findings, and it painted a clear picture of how Holt had been using his power to manipulate local officials, falsify permits, and bribe city planners. The room fell silent as the judge read through the documents. Holt's lawyer stood up, his face red with anger. "Your Honor, this is a baseless accusation. We request that you strike this new evidence from the record." But the judge didn't even flinch. "I'm not inclined to strike this evidence, Mr. Palmer," he said, his voice firm. "The truth will come to light, and this court will see it through." Elizabeth could hardly believe what she was hearing. The walls were closing in on Holt, and there was nowhere for him to hide. For the first time, she felt the weight of the trial shift in her favor. But there was still so much more to uncover. Holt would not go down without a fight, and Elizabeth knew this was just the beginning. As the session broke for lunch, Elizabeth and her lawyer, David, huddled in a quiet corner of the courtroom. Elizabeth's heart was still racing from the shock of Ryan's unexpected testimony. "Do you think this is it?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. David nodded. "It's a big step, but Holt won't give up without a fight. We need to stay focused. This is just one piece of the puzzle. We still have a long way to go." Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising within her. The trial had just taken an unexpected turn, and for the first time, it felt like she might actually have a chance at bringing Holt to justice. But as she sat in that corner, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. Holt was dangerous, and if he had his way, he would do anything to protect his empire. And Elizabeth Dawson was about to find out just how far he was willing to go. The next day, the courtroom buzzed with an intensity that made Elizabeth's heart race. The fresh wave of evidence brought in by Ryan Miller had shaken Alexander Holt's defense, but they were far from surrendering. Holt himself had become increasingly agitated, his usual smug demeanor replaced by an air of tension. His lawyers were working overtime, frantically trying to discredit everything that had been presented. Elizabeth sat at the plaintiff's table, her gaze steady, but her mind was racing. The evidence was overwhelming, and she could see that Holt's empire was beginning to crumble. But this was just the beginning. She knew Holt wasn't going to give up without a fight. He had always been a master of manipulation, and she couldn't let her guard down. Judge Larson entered the room, his gavel striking sharply as the crowd quieted. Today, the trial was reaching a critical juncture. The defense had requested a recess to review the new documents that had been introduced, but Elizabeth knew that it wouldn't be long before Holt would try to pull some sort of stunt to derail the trial. "Mr. Palmer," Judge Larson said, addressing Holt's lawyer, "you've had ample time to review the documents. We will proceed with the presentation of evidence. No further delays." Holt's lawyer opened his mouth to argue, but the judge silenced him with a stern look. Elizabeth felt a surge of relief. It seemed that the tide was finally turning in her favor, but she knew better than to assume the worst was over. As the trial continued, a sense of anticipation settled over the courtroom. The judge called for the next witness to take the stand, Ryan Miller. Elizabeth had already seen his testimony in the morning session, but now it was time for cross-examination. Holt's defense team was going to tear into him. She knew they would do whatever they could to undermine his credibility. Ryan stepped up to the witness stand, his hands trembling as he took the oath. He looked determined, though, and Elizabeth could see that he was no longer the man who had hesitated to speak up. He was a whistleblower now, a man who had seen too much to remain silent. He was ready to face the consequences. David Sanchez stood up, calling Ryan to the stand. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice calm but firm, "please tell the court about your time at Holt Enterprises and your role in the company." Ryan took a deep breath before he began. "I worked as a senior project manager at Holt Enterprises for over a decade," he said, his voice steady. "I oversaw a number of high-profile developments, including the one involving the community center. I was involved in coordinating permits, dealing with contractors, and managing the financial side of the projects." Elizabeth watched as Ryan spoke, his words clear and precise. It was becoming evident to the court that he had been deeply involved in Holt's operations, and the weight of his testimony was undeniable. David continued, "What did you witness during your time at Holt Enterprises?" Ryan hesitated for a moment before answering. "I saw things that should never have happened. There were multiple instances where safety regulations were ignored, permits were forged, and bribes were paid to ensure that projects moved forward, regardless of the cost to the community or the environment." The courtroom was silent, and Elizabeth could feel the impact of Ryan's words as they echoed through the room. Holt's defense team immediately stood up, attempting to discredit Ryan's testimony. "Objection, Your Honor!" Holt's lawyer shouted. "This is pure hearsay. Mr. Miller is simply trying to cover his own failures. None of these allegations are substantiated." Judge Larson looked over at Ryan. "Mr. Miller," he asked, his tone stern, "are these allegations you've made based on personal knowledge and experience? Or are you simply repeating what you've heard?" Ryan's voice was calm, but resolute. "These are things I saw firsthand. I was part of the process. I raised concerns multiple times, but I was told to keep quiet, or lose my job. Eventually, I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. I quit, and I've come forward now because the truth needs to come out." Elizabeth felt a wave of pride wash over her as Ryan spoke. His courage was undeniable. He wasn't backing down, and neither was she. Holt had underestimated how far she was willing to go to expose him. The defense lawyer continued to press, trying to weaken Ryan's testimony, but Ryan stood firm. He wasn't going to let Holt's team twist his words or make him out to be a liar. Each answer he gave seemed to solidify the case against Holt. But just as the momentum seemed to be swinging in Elizabeth's favor, Holt made his move. He stood up abruptly, his voice booming across the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, his voice filled with anger, "I cannot allow this trial to continue. I am being threatened. My life is at risk because of this case." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Elizabeth couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was Holt trying to turn the tables? Was this another one of his tactics to delay the trial? Judge Larson didn't seem convinced. "Mr. Holt, unless you have concrete proof of this claim, you will remain seated and allow this trial to proceed. We do not tolerate distractions in this courtroom." Holt hesitated, his face flushed with frustration. "I have evidence," he said, his voice shaking. "I have reason to believe that someone in this courtroom is working against me, trying to undermine my company and my reputation. This is part of a larger conspiracy." Elizabeth's heart sank. Was he trying to cast doubt on her? Was this his final attempt to smear her and discredit everything she had worked for? The judge didn't let him continue. "Mr. Holt, if you have evidence of these claims, you may submit it in due time. For now, we will continue." Elizabeth couldn't believe what had just happened. Holt was desperate. He was trying to divert attention away from the case and cast doubt on the evidence. But it wasn't working. The tide had already turned, and now it was a matter of seeing the trial through to the end. As Ryan's testimony wrapped up, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The more Ryan revealed about Holt's illegal activities, the more it seemed like the walls were closing in. Holt's smugness had faded, replaced by a hint of panic. But even with this progress, Elizabeth knew she couldn't relax. Holt was ruthless, and he had the resources to fight back. This trial wasn't over yet. The next day, as the trial resumed, there was a new tension in the air. Elizabeth and David prepared for the next round. Holt's defense was going to be fierce, and they knew that Holt wouldn't go down without a fight. But Elizabeth was determined. She had already come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. The following days felt like a whirlwind as Elizabeth stood firm in the courtroom, watching as the defense team for Holt Enterprises fought tooth and nail to discredit the mounting evidence. Every piece of new information, from the emails to the internal memos, seemed to push Alexander Holt further into a corner. The evidence was damning, but Holt's resources, his legal team, his PR machine, his wealth, were vast. Elizabeth knew that the fight was far from over. He had already tried to manipulate the trial once, and she couldn't help but feel he was gearing up for another move. Late one night, as Elizabeth worked late into the night in her office at the community center, a knock at the door broke her concentration. Startled, she stood up and cautiously approached the door. When she opened it, a man stood in the doorway. He was tall and wore a dark suit, his face etched with worry. "Ms. Dawson?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Elizabeth replied, confused. She didn't recognize him. "I'm Ryan Chase," the man said quickly. "I've been working with Holt Enterprises for years. I'm here to talk." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the name. Ryan Chase was one of the senior executives at Holt Enterprises, someone who had likely known about the company's shady dealings. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to allow him in. Once inside, Ryan looked around nervously before speaking. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but I have information that you need. I know what Holt is doing, and I know what's at stake. There are people within the company who want him to fall. I'm one of them." Elizabeth's mind raced. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for. Someone from the inside. Someone with the power to take Holt down. But the air in the room was thick with tension, and she could feel the danger looming. "I don't know if I can trust you," Elizabeth said, her voice steady, despite the fear that bubbled beneath her calm exterior. Ryan looked at her earnestly. "I understand your hesitation, but I've seen enough to know that if we don't stop him now, everything will be lost. I've already risked everything just by coming here. I'm ready to help you expose Holt for what he really is." Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, her mind racing as she weighed the consequences. If this man was who he claimed to be, he could be the key to bringing down Holt's empire. But she knew the risks were high. If Holt caught wind of what was happening, both she and Ryan could be in grave danger. "I'm listening," she said, her voice determined. The next morning, Elizabeth met with David Sanchez and the rest of her legal team to discuss what Ryan had revealed. Ryan Chase had provided critical new evidence, proof of Holt's involvement in several illegal schemes beyond the scope of the community center project. Holt had been using his real estate developments as fronts for money laundering and bribery, making millions off of projects that had no regard for the safety or well-being of the people they affected. Ryan also provided the names of other key figures inside Holt Enterprises who were willing to testify if the right pressure was applied. It was a game changer. "We need to move fast," David said, after reviewing the new evidence. "This could be the final piece of the puzzle we need to break Holt's defense wide open." Elizabeth nodded. "But we have to be careful. Holt has resources we can't even begin to understand. If he finds out we're making moves like this, he'll retaliate. We can't afford to make any mistakes." David's expression grew grim. "I know. But if we don't act now, we might lose the opportunity." The new evidence was submitted to the court the following day, and Elizabeth could already feel the shift. Holt's defense team fought tooth and nail to prevent it from being presented, but it was undeniable. The documents, emails, and testimonies from former employees painted a picture of Holt as a man who would do anything to maintain control over his empire, including manipulating politicians and executives to cover up his illegal activities. Despite the mounting pressure, Holt's arrogance seemed to know no bounds. Every time he stood in court, his smirk remained firmly in place, as though he believed he could turn the tide at any moment. But the cracks in his armor were starting to show. His defense team was flailing, and the jury seemed more and more convinced that Elizabeth's case was airtight. But as the trial reached its most critical juncture, Elizabeth began to feel the weight of what she had gotten herself into. She had already received several anonymous threats meant to intimidate her into backing down. At first, she shrugged them off, thinking they were just scare tactics. But that was before the black car showed up outside her apartment one night. Elizabeth had just finished working late, as usual, when she noticed the car parked down the street. Its windows were tinted so dark that she couldn't see inside, but something about the car felt off. Her heart started to race as she glanced around, making sure she wasn't being followed. She quickly got into her car and started the engine, but just as she was about to pull away, the headlights of the black car flickered on. It followed her, keeping a steady distance behind her as she drove. The adrenaline surged through her veins as she realized she was being tailed. She tried to shake the car, making several unexpected turns, but it stayed with her. The fear gripped her chest as she raced toward her apartment complex, praying that she could lose the car before it was too late. When she finally parked and looked around, the black car was nowhere in sight. She sat in her car for several moments, trying to steady her breathing. Was it Holt's people? Had they discovered that she was getting closer to exposing him? She couldn't be sure, but the fear was real. This wasn't just about the community center anymore. It was about her life. Back in the courtroom, the tension continued to build. The evidence against Holt was mounting with every new piece of testimony and document presented. Holt's lawyer, Mr. Palmer, tried to counter every argument, but Elizabeth could feel the momentum shifting. The judge had become increasingly impatient with the defense's delays, and Holt's confident posture was beginning to crumble. As the session came to a close, Elizabeth and David made their way back to the small office they had set up in the courthouse. Just as they were about to sit down to review the next steps, the door to the office suddenly burst open. A man in a dark hoodie walked in. His eyes darted around the room before he stepped forward. "Ms. Dawson," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." Elizabeth froze. This was it. Whoever this man was, he knew something she needed to hear. But what was it? Before she could respond, the man handed her a folded note. "They're watching you," he said quietly. "Be careful." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She unfolded the note, her fingers trembling as she read the simple message written inside. "You're in over your head." The note was unsigned. The next few days felt like a game of chess. Every move that Elizabeth made, every piece of evidence that was presented, Holt's legal team countered with their own tactics. The stakes had never been higher, and as the trial pushed forward, so did the tension in the courtroom. Elizabeth knew that Holt wasn't going to give up without a fight. He had resources, influence, and a ruthless streak that ran deep. But Elizabeth was ready for whatever he threw at her. Still, despite all the evidence against him, Holt maintained a calm, almost defiant air. Every time Elizabeth looked at him, sitting confidently at the defense table, she saw nothing but a man who believed he could get away with anything. His eyes, though, flickered with anxiety when he thought no one was looking. Holt knew the walls were closing in, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. That evening, as Elizabeth was reviewing the latest set of documents from her legal team, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The anonymous threats had escalated. Late-night calls, strange men following her when she walked to her car. It was clear that someone wanted to intimidate her into backing down. The note she'd received earlier that day was the final warning. "You're in over your head." The words still echoed in her mind. Who could it be? Who was behind this? The threat was too specific to ignore, and as the days passed, Elizabeth could feel herself growing more paranoid. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Holt's people were everywhere, and she could see that he was doing everything in his power to derail the case. He was trying to make her look like a fool, trying to discredit her at every turn. And it was working. People in the media were starting to ask questions. Was Elizabeth truly on the right side of the law? Was she just some naive idealist trying to fight the system? Despite all of this, she refused to let Holt win. The following morning, as Elizabeth entered the courtroom, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. There was a sense of unease in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen. The defense team for Holt Enterprises had filed another motion, but it was clear they were scrambling. Holt's lawyers were using every dirty trick in the book to distract from the overwhelming evidence that was being presented. They filed motions for mistrials, they asked for continuances, they tried to spin the narrative in their favor, but Elizabeth could feel the tide turning. Then, just as the judge was about to announce the next phase of the trial, there was a disruption. The door to the courtroom swung open, and a woman walked in, her presence commanding immediate attention. She was tall, with a sharp gray suit, and an air of authority that made everyone in the room take notice. As she made her way toward the front of the courtroom, all eyes followed her. The woman didn't wait for an introduction. She walked straight to the bench, holding up a federal warrant. "Your Honor," she said in a clear, firm voice, I am Special Agent Evelyn Carter with the Department of Justice. I have a federal warrant to seize all evidence presented in this case. This trial is now part of an active federal investigation into Holt Enterprises. The courtroom fell silent, and Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Federal agents. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Judge Larson's face hardened as he looked at the document. "This is highly unusual," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Why now?" Agent Carter didn't flinch. "Because we've uncovered new evidence that directly ties Holt Enterprises to criminal activities beyond the scope of this trial," she said, her voice unwavering. "Holt is under investigation for money laundering, bribery, and illegal business practices. We have already begun an investigation, and we believe the evidence presented here will play a critical role in our case." Elizabeth could feel her heart race. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The feds had just entered the picture, and suddenly Holt's control over the case seemed to weaken. It was no longer just a courtroom fight. This was now a federal matter. In the back of the courtroom, Holt's expression darkened. His usual air of arrogance had been replaced with visible unease. He whispered quickly to his lawyer, who stood up and immediately objected. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice strained, "this is highly irregular. We were not informed of any federal investigation until now. This could compromise the integrity of the trial." Judge Larson held up his hand, silencing the defense lawyer. "The law is clear, Mr. Palmer," he said. "The Department of Justice has the right to intervene when new evidence comes to light, especially when it concerns criminal activity. I will allow Agent Carter to seize the evidence." Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. Holt had just lost his grip on the case, and now the federal government was involved. Holt was no longer the only one with the power to manipulate the system. As the session resumed, Agent Carter and her team began reviewing the evidence that had been presented so far. She was meticulous, and it was clear she wasn't going to let Holt escape. With every document they reviewed, Elizabeth felt her resolve strengthen. The fight wasn't just about the community center anymore. It was about holding Holt accountable for everything he had done. During a brief recess, Elizabeth stood by the window, staring out at the street. Her mind raced with the possibilities. The Department of Justice was on her side now. But Holt wasn't going to take this lying down. He would fight with everything he had, and Elizabeth knew the next move was critical. As she turned to walk back to her seat, she was stopped by a voice. "Ms. Dawson," a man said, stepping out from the shadows. Elizabeth froze. It was Ryan Chase, the whistleblower from Holt Enterprises. He was alone, and there was a look of urgency in his eyes. "Do you have something new for me?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tense. Ryan looked around nervously, checking to see if anyone was nearby. "Yes, but we don't have much time. Holt knows that the feds are involved now. He'll do everything he can to stop us." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What's he planning?" Ryan hesitated for a moment, then spoke quickly. "Holt has a backup plan. He's been working with some very dangerous people who will stop at nothing to keep him in power. I don't know how much longer we have before they move against us." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. Holt wasn't just a businessman. He was a man with powerful, dangerous connections. And now that the federal government was closing in on him, there was no telling what lengths he would go to protect himself. "We need to act fast," Ryan said, his voice tight with urgency. "Get ready. Holt's going to make a move. We need to be one step ahead of him." Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. The stakes were higher than ever, and she had no idea what Holt would do next. But she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. The courtroom doors opened just as Elizabeth was making her way back to her seat. Ryan's warning echoed in her mind, but she pushed the fear aside. There was too much at stake to be intimidated now. She could feel Holt's eyes on her, his gaze cold and calculating, but she didn't flinch. She was ready for whatever came next. This fight wasn't over, and Elizabeth Dawson was prepared to see it through to the end. The following day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The presence of Special Agent Evelyn Carter and her team had added a new layer of complexity to the trial. Holt Enterprises was no longer just a corporate defendant. Now it was a criminal investigation, and Alexander Holt himself was at the center of it all. But Elizabeth couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Holt wasn't finished yet. He still had his cards to play, and she knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. As the trial resumed, Elizabeth took her seat, feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The judge, seeing the growing influence of the Department of Justice, had decided to continue allowing the federal team to review the evidence as it came in. The prosecution had presented a mountain of proof, emails, financial records, and witness testimony, all showing Holt's hand in bribery, money laundering, and illegal business practices. But Elizabeth knew the next few days could make or break the case. Holt's defense team was still formidable, and Holt himself was as determined as ever to protect his empire. That afternoon, Elizabeth left the courthouse and walked to her car, hoping to catch a breath before the next session. As she neared the parking lot, she noticed something strange. A black SUV was parked a few spots down, its windows tinted, the engine idling. She had seen this car before, on the night she'd been followed. Her heart began to race as the car's headlights flickered on and the engine revved. She quickly ducked behind a nearby pillar, her eyes scanning the area. The car didn't move immediately, but Elizabeth had no intention of sticking around to see what came next. She hurried to her car, her pulse quickening. Just as she reached her vehicle, a voice called out to her from behind. "Miss Dawson!" She spun around, only to find herself face to face with two men in dark suits. One of them took a step forward, blocking her path. "We need to talk," one of the men said, in a voice that was calm but menacing. Elizabeth's heart raced. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. "What do you want?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're here to deliver a message," the man continued. "You're getting too close to something you don't understand. Back off now, or there will be consequences." Elizabeth's mind raced. Who were these men? Were they from Holt's team? She couldn't afford to show fear, but every fiber of her being screamed to escape. She took a slow step back, her hand reaching for the door handle. Before she could get in, one of the men stepped forward quickly, blocking her way. "This is your only warning, Ms. Dawson. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just intimidation. This was real. She had no idea how far Holt was willing to go, but these men were clearly dangerous. "Stay away from me," Elizabeth said firmly, trying to push past them. But just as she attempted to get into her car, one of the men grabbed her arm. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he growled. Suddenly, there was a loud screech of tires in the distance, and the men froze. The sound of sirens cut through the air. It wasn't long before a black SUV pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. The men quickly released Elizabeth's arm and turned toward the vehicle. A woman in tactical gear stepped out. Agent Carter. "Move aside," Agent Carter commanded. She stepped forward with authority, and the men didn't hesitate. They immediately backed off and climbed into their SUV, driving away without a word. Elizabeth stood there, trembling, trying to catch her breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, the threat still fresh in her mind. But Agent Carter was already beside her. "Are you okay?" Carter asked, her voice softer than before, though still filled with determination. Elizabeth nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "I think so. But this is getting serious. Holt won't stop." Agent Carter looked at her seriously. "This is just the beginning, Ms. Dawson. But you're not alone in this. We're tracking every move they make. Holt's people can try to intimidate you all they want, but you have the law on your side now." Elizabeth looked at Carter, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. But she knew it wasn't over. If Holt had people like this, his reach extended far beyond what anyone had anticipated. He was pulling out all the stops. "I can't back down now," Elizabeth said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Not with everything at stake." Carter nodded. "You've done the right thing by standing up to him, and we're going to make sure Holt doesn't get away with it." Later that evening, Elizabeth met with her legal team to review the new evidence. As they discussed strategy, she couldn't ignore the sense of urgency that had settled over her. Holt was no longer just fighting for his company. He was fighting for his freedom. His empire was unraveling, and he would do anything to protect it. As the meeting wrapped up, David looked at Elizabeth, his expression serious. "We need to be cautious. Holt won't give up easily. If anything, I think he's just getting started. Be careful." Elizabeth nodded, but the warning didn't faze her. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to let Holt or his people intimidate her into backing down. The next morning, as she made her way to the courthouse, Elizabeth felt the weight of the situation press down on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would either make or break this case. As the trial began, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Holt's legal team had prepared a last-ditch effort to sway the jury. They were throwing everything at Elizabeth. Attempts to discredit her, to paint her as a manipulator, someone who was seeking personal glory. It was the same tactic they had been using for weeks. But Elizabeth wasn't fazed. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't about to let Holt turn the tables now. She had already seen the cracks in his empire, and with the Department of Justice on her side, she could feel the walls closing in. Just as the judge was about to call for a break, the door to the courtroom opened with a loud bang. A man in a suit walked in, breathless, carrying a folder. He was sweating and looked out of place, but his presence immediately drew attention. "I have more evidence," he said, panting as he approached the front of the room. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to the man. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. This was the break they needed, the final piece of the puzzle. The man who had entered the courtroom so unexpectedly made his way to the judge's bench, his hands trembling as he handed over the folder. The courtroom was silent, the tension almost suffocating as everyone waited to see what new evidence he was presenting. Elizabeth's heart raced as she watched the man, his face pale and drenched in sweat. She could sense that this was the moment that would either secure victory or mark the end of the road for them. Judge Larson took the folder, eyeing it carefully before opening it. He scanned the first few pages, his brow furrowing with every word he read. The room was on edge, and even Holt's defense team seemed to realize that the game was changing. "Mr. Palmer," the judge said, looking over at Holt's lawyer, "you may wish to review this evidence before we proceed." Palmer, the defense attorney, stood up sharply. "Your Honor," he began, his voice filled with disbelief, "this is highly irregular. This man cannot just walk into the courtroom and present new evidence without prior submission. We demand that this be dismissed immediately." Judge Larson raised his hand, silencing him. "The law is clear, Mr. Palmer. If this evidence is deemed relevant to the case, it will be presented. We will review it and proceed accordingly." I will not allow this trial to be derailed by procedural delays." Holt's lawyer fumed, his face turning red as he tried to argue, but the judge's ruling was final. The man who had brought the new evidence was allowed to take the stand. "I've worked for Holt Enterprises for over a decade," the man said, his voice shaky but clear. "I can't stay silent anymore. Holt is a criminal, and I have proof." Elizabeth's mind was racing. Was this another whistleblower? Could this be the breakthrough they had been hoping for? She glanced at David, who was watching intently, his face reflecting the same hope. This was a game changer. The man continued, telling the court how Holt had been involved in money laundering, how his company had funneled millions through shell companies and offshore accounts. He detailed meetings where bribes had been paid to local officials to ensure that Holt's development projects moved forward without any legal or regulatory oversight. The room grew tense as he described the illegal dealings in painstaking detail. Holt's defense team stood up in unison, their objections growing louder as they tried to discredit the man's testimony. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a desperate attempt to smear my client. This is not credible testimony, and it has no place in this courtroom." The judge, however, ignored their protests. He turned to the man on the stand, his expression serious. "What is your name, and what exactly are you accusing Mr. Holt of?" "I'm David Hargrove," the man said, his voice gaining strength. "I worked directly under Mr. Holt as a senior executive. I've seen it all, Your Honor. Holt is not just a businessman. He's a criminal, and I'm here to make sure he faces justice." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She had seen David Hargrove's name in the documents she had reviewed, but hearing his testimony firsthand was more powerful than she could have ever imagined. The weight of his words hit her like a ton of bricks. Holt had built his empire on lies, deceit, and the manipulation of the law. And now, for the first time, someone from inside the machine was standing up to expose it. As the session continued, David detailed more of Holt's illegal activities, including his involvement in orchestrating the destruction of the community center to make way for his high-end development. He spoke about the bribes Holt had paid to local politicians, the falsified permits, and the under-the-table deals that allowed Holt to circumvent the law. The evidence was damning, and Elizabeth could see Holt's defenses crumbling in real time. But just as the tide seemed to be turning in their favor, Holt's lawyer made one final desperate move. He stood up and announced, "Your Honor, we request an immediate recess. My client is in grave danger. We have reason to believe that the evidence presented here today is part of a larger conspiracy to frame Mr. Holt." The courtroom went silent. Holt himself stood up, his face pale, his expression twisted with panic. "I can't continue this trial under these conditions," he said, his voice trembling. "My life is at risk. Someone in this courtroom is trying to destroy me, and I have evidence to prove it." Elizabeth stared at Holt in disbelief. Was this his final play? Was he trying to turn the tables and claim that he was the victim here? Judge Larson was not convinced. He slammed his gavel down. "Mr. Holt, I have heard enough. If you have evidence of this supposed conspiracy, present it now. Otherwise, we will continue with the trial." Holt hesitated, looking at his lawyer. The tension in the room was thick, and Elizabeth could feel the weight of the moment. Holt had been trying to manipulate the court from the beginning, but now it seemed like he was trying to use fear to his advantage. The judge, however, was not intimidated. "I will not tolerate further delays, Mr. Holt," Judge Larson said. "You may present your evidence at the appropriate time, but this trial will proceed as scheduled." Holt's face turned red with anger, but he sat back down, knowing that his bluff had failed. The moment of crisis passed, and the trial continued. As the day went on, Elizabeth could feel the momentum building in her favor. With every piece of new evidence that came to light, Holt's control over the case slipped further away. David Hargrove's testimony had been the turning point they needed, but Elizabeth knew they weren't done yet. Holt was still dangerous, and his people were still out there, lurking in the shadows, trying to intimidate her into backing down. After the session ended, Elizabeth met with David, her heart still racing from the intensity of the day. "We're getting closer," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that coursed through her. "But Holt isn't going to stop. We need to be careful." David nodded, his expression serious. "He's desperate now. He'll do anything to protect himself. But we have the evidence. We're not backing down." Elizabeth took a deep breath and nodded. We're not backing down. Later that evening, Elizabeth sat alone in her office, staring at the piles of evidence that had accumulated over the past few months. She thought about the families who depended on the community center, the people whose lives had been turned upside down by Holt's greed. This fight wasn't just about her. It was about them. And she wasn't going to let Holt get away with destroying everything they had worked for. But as she sat there, the door to her office creaked open. Elizabeth looked up, startled, and saw a familiar face standing in the doorway. It was Ryan Chase, the whistleblower. "I need your help," he said, his voice urgent. Elizabeth stood up, her heart racing. "What's wrong?" "They know we're getting close," Ryan said, his face pale. "Holt's people, they're coming for me. And if they get to me, they'll get to you too." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Holt wasn't just playing for his freedom anymore. He was playing for his life. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Holt's empire, once seemingly indestructible, was crumbling under the weight of the evidence and testimonies that Elizabeth and her legal team had presented. But Holt was not going down without a fight. His threats were becoming more frequent, more dangerous. As Ryan Chase had warned, Holt's people were closing in, desperate to silence anyone who could bring the truth to light. Elizabeth had never felt more vulnerable. Despite the protection from the Department of Justice, she knew that Holt's reach extended far beyond the courtroom. Still, she couldn't let the fear paralyze her. She had already come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. The community center, the families who depended on it, and the people who had risked everything to expose Holt were depending on her to see this through. The final stretch of the trial was a blur. Holt's defense continued to flail, but every time they tried to discredit the evidence or manipulate the truth, Elizabeth's team countered with an even more compelling argument. David Hargrove's testimony had been a game-changer, and the additional whistleblowers who came forward only strengthened the case against Holt. Elizabeth had been waiting for this moment for months, and now it felt like they were so close to the finish line. But then, just when they thought they had gained the upper hand, Holt made a final, desperate move. During a routine recess, Elizabeth and her legal team were in the middle of discussing their next steps when a dark SUV pulled into the courthouse parking lot. Elizabeth's heart dropped as she watched the vehicle stop near the entrance. This wasn't just a coincidence. Holt had sent someone. She knew it immediately. She turned to David, her voice tight with anxiety. "We need to get out of here. Now." David's eyes widened as he saw the car door open, and a man stepped out, dressed in a dark suit. The man's expression was unreadable, but Elizabeth could feel the danger radiating from him. This was no ordinary visit. This was Holt's final attempt to scare them off. Before they could react, a familiar figure appeared from the crowd. It was Agent Carter. "Get moving," she said, her voice urgent. "They've found out about the next witness. We need to leave." Elizabeth followed Agent Carter and David quickly through a back exit of the courthouse. As they made their way to a secure vehicle, Elizabeth's mind raced. Holt had finally figured out their strategy. He was closing in, trying to disrupt the final stages of the trial. But they weren't going to let him win. Not now. The next morning, the court was in chaos. News had leaked that Holt had attempted to bribe a key witness, and the media was swarming outside the courthouse. But inside, the focus was on the final piece of evidence. The flash drive that Ryan Chase had given to Elizabeth, containing a treasure trove of information about Holt's illegal activities. Elizabeth knew this was their moment. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. When the trial reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. Every word spoken in the courtroom carried immense weight. Elizabeth and her team presented the final batch of evidence, including the flash drive. The documents, emails, and videos revealed the full extent of Holt's corruption, including his plans to manipulate not just the local authorities, but also global financial institutions to launder money through his development projects. The scope of his criminal enterprise was staggering, and there was no way he could talk his way out of it this time. As the evidence was displayed for the jury, Holt sat in stunned silence. His once confident expression had faded, replaced by a mixture of fear and disbelief. His lawyer tried one final, half-hearted attempt to dismiss the new evidence, but the judge wasn't having it. "This is the final warning, Mr. Palmer," Judge Larson said firmly. "Any further interruptions will result in contempt. The jury has seen the evidence, and we will proceed." Elizabeth watched as Holt's defenses crumbled. His empire, his carefully constructed web of lies, was finally unraveling before his eyes, and she couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. It had taken months of hard work, sacrifice, and countless sleepless nights, but it was all worth it. Holt would finally pay for his crimes. The verdict came just days later, and when it was announced, it sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Alexander Holt was found guilty on all charges: bribery, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence had been undeniable. The jury had seen through his lies, and now the man who had once been untouchable was facing the consequences of his actions. Elizabeth stood in the courtroom, her hands trembling slightly, as the judge handed down the sentence. Holt was to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community center, once threatened with demolition, would now be preserved, and the funds raised through the trial would be used to expand and improve it. As the gavel came down, Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. Holt's reign of greed and corruption had come to an end, and justice had prevailed. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth was hailed as a hero. The media covered her story extensively, and she received messages of support from all over the country. Donations poured in to help fund the community center's renovation, and volunteers from across Chicago came together to help with the work. One evening, as Elizabeth stood outside the community center, watching the renovations take shape, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the building. Children played in the yard, their laughter filling the air. Families gathered, and the center once again became a place of hope. Agent Carter approached, her face softening with a rare smile. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Elizabeth smiled back. "We did it. We couldn't have done this without everyone who believed in it." As they watched the work continue, Elizabeth's thoughts turned to the journey she had just completed. The fight against Holt had been grueling, and it had taken everything she had. But in the end, it wasn't just about defeating him. It was about the people whose lives had been affected by his greed. It was about making sure that they had a place to call their own, a place where they could find support and hope in times of need. Elizabeth looked at the growing crowd, her heart swelling with pride. This victory wasn't just hers, it was the community's. It was proof that even the most powerful figures could be held accountable, and that justice could prevail when people came together to fight for what was right. As she walked toward her car, she glanced at her phone. There was a message from her brother Adam. "Proud of you, Claire. You're a hero." A smile spread across her face as she texted him back. "We all are." And for the first time in months, Elizabeth felt at peace. The battle had been long, but the victory was sweet. Holt had been brought to justice, the community center had been saved, and the families who depended on it had a future. This wasn't just the end of a trial, it was the beginning of something much bigger. And Elizabeth Dawson, the woman who had fought tirelessly against the system, was ready to continue the fight for justice, knowing that her work had only just begun.